Starting the show. So hello, I would like to, this is Sherry Cohen, and I would like to call the meeting of the Human and Community Development Committee to order. I think everyone by now is doing a great job, but please just remember to use the mute button on the app or the mute button if you're calling in on *6 on your phone when you are not speaking. Also want to notify everyone that as permitted by the Governor's Disaster Declaration of November 13th, 2020, the determination has been made that an in-person meeting is not practical or prudent for this committee. To ensure a transparent and open meeting as possible, we will post the meeting materials approximately 1 week in advance. Hopefully you all got that. And we'll provide a recording of this meeting linked to our website, and we'll take all votes by roll call. From here now, we're moving to agenda changes and announcement, and Cmap staff has a few announcements.
Thanks, Sherry. As was implied, this meeting will be recorded and posted. Please let us know if you're having any issues muting or unmuting yourselves in the chat. Please use the chat for questions and state your name that you would like to make a public comment if you're on the phone. And when making, and members, when making a motion, please state your name.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. And now we're moving into approval of minutes. So to make this as seamless as possible, we'll combine attendance roll call with the approval of minutes. So I am looking to get a motion and a second to approve the minutes of October 6, 2020 for our committee. So please, when you're making the motion, to remember to unmute yourself, state your name, and state your name. Also, you can state your name. So I guess first, if someone's able to first move for making the motion to approve the minutes.
So moved. Melody Tracy, Active Transportation Alliance.
Okay, and any seconds?
Jackie Forbes, second.
Great, thank you so much. Are there any questions or changes from anyone on the minutes? Okay, great, thank you so much. So next we'll continue on with our roll call. And so if community members, again, unmute yourself and let's see, I guess I was reading, I'm gonna read the names of the members. So if you can just respond with present and then your vote on the minutes, a yay, nay, or abstain. So I think I will go from, hold on. Uh-oh. See if we have everybody on here. Okay. So I'm just going to read off the names from the list we have on our agenda. So Alicia Bunton, are you on the line?
Morning, yes, I am present, and yay for the minutes.
Great, thank you. And Fluturi, I'm not going to be able to pronounce it. Demirovsky. Okay. Lori Dittman.
Here and yes.
Jackie Forbes.
Forbes here and yes on the minutes.
Great. Joan Fox.
Joan Fox, present, and yes on the minutes.
Okay, great, thank you so much. Kendra Freeman. Okay. Melody Tracy.
Present, and I moved on the minutes.
Okay, yes. I guess we just get that, move on that forward. Jackie Grimshaw.
Here and yes.
Great, nice to see you. Hannah Kite. Okay. Gretchen Knowlton.
Here and yes.
Tiffany McDowell.
I'm here and yes.
Great. Greg Pullman,
Here and yay.
Obayi Reed,
Present, yay.
okay. Enrique Salgado, Raj Shah, Rosalie Shemmer, Darnell Shields,
Present and yay.
thank you. Jana Simon,
Present and yay.
Dominic Tochi, and William Towns. Okay. So seeing that they were all yays, it appears that motion is carried. So now we're going to go to our next item. Thank you, everybody, and thank you for joining us to member updates. So really talking about, I think this is a great thing to add into what we've been doing to really hear from different members, to hear how your organizations are responding to all the COVID-19 pandemic and work on health equity and racial and economic justice. So first, Darnell Shields, you're going to be able to give us an update? That would be wonderful.
Sure. Yeah, so I think I can talk a little bit about some of the things that we've been doing throughout this, kind of pandemic, and at least over the past several months, dating back as far as April, when sort of everything kind of hit in terms of the COVID and sort of the impact that it was having on, our community. As I think everybody knows, or, I think it's more broadly understood that communities initially, African-American communities that were sort of had the greatest toll taken on them in terms of COVID-19 and like the impact of it from a health perspective. And so, kind of, I'll just share that when, things really started off in late March and April, something that, we saw in our community was really like the safety net within the community was paralyzed. And the reason for this, I think, was mostly around because a lot of the organizations that had been providing services for community members to address a lot of the longstanding issues, that we were already faced, really just got, just thrown into a state of ambiguity and uncertainty around how they could actually respond, what resources they would have to be able to respond, to something that everyone was still kind of learning about and trying to understand. And so, with that being the case, and then how COVID was ravaging the community, although our organization is really one of a collective impact and more of a coordinator, connector, planner, if you will, around helping to build capacity of different groups and providers in the community, we really kind of found ourselves having to stand up infrastructure and infrastructure for the community to respond in lieu of some of this paralysis that we were seeing across the safety net. And what that resulted in is us really bringing forth sort of a strategy around advocacy, communications, resource development, as well as resource deployment. And some of the things that, we found ourselves having to respond to initially were really around, one of the greatest was around food insecurity, which, most folks have heard that Austin or, communities on the West Side are food deserts. But, we saw that that sort of connotation come to life in a way that, we've never seen in our community in terms of like people's ability to be able to access food, whether not even just healthy food, just food in general. And so, we had to really kind of work in tandem with different groups locally, as well as even the greater food Greater Chicago Food Depository and the mayor's office and so forth to be able to try to stand up to increase access beyond the food pantries that were already available. And one of the things that we ended up doing, actually, we stood up food pop-up sites throughout, started up in late April, May, and actually facilitated those all the way through going towards September. And over that time period, I believe we distributed probably a little bit over 700,000 pounds of food throughout the community, and to about maybe over 10,000 households. And when you think about a community like Austin that was already suffering in this area, to actually have to increase what is actually being distributed and put forth, it's just staggering to think about. And in addition to food insecurity, there were other issues around financial assistance, other issues around housing, which was another a huge strain within the community. And lastly, the digital divide. I mean, you guys have heard a lot about Chicago Connected and a lot of those the programming around that with CPS to be able to try to help connect internet to a lot of the households throughout the city. Well, Austin had the largest count in terms of disconnected households across the city. Almost 13,000 households were disconnected, and this is something that we have been advocating for even prior to the pandemic. But as the pandemic kind of took root and saw the schools closing and all those things, we really kind of heightened a lot of our advocacy efforts around it. And it's also one of the things and one of the reasons that helped that program, Chicago Connected, really start to take shape, because you had community leaders and organizations like in Austin and others across the city that really started to vocalize, the need for this. And, now we serve as the lead agency in the Austin community to help connect these households through the Chicago Connected program. And the way we've approached it is really mobilizing a lot of our partners and other organizations to be able to increase our collective impact in doing so. Because again, one organization trying to be able to serve and connect almost 13,000 households in a time period within a school year is daunting. And so, trying to do that within 30 to 60 days, it's just even more immense. And so we really looked at, how can we mobilize several organizations to be able to ramp up to increase the numbers. And to date, we've been able to mobilize almost 6 organizations with a total of about 40 individuals, 40 people to facilitate this outreach. And we're actually just rounding out to being able to finalize all of our outreach through that program. So now we're going to be moving into the digital literacy phase, where we start to engage all of these households to provide them more digital literacy support. I think, the thing that I can just kind of highlight or preface with all of this is, we were already a challenged community really dealing with a number of deficits over, over decades. And to have, a pandemic come and just literally, exacerbate all of those things, it really caused us to have to step back and think about, how we are working together, how we are approaching a lot of the immediate work, but why the long-term the things that we put in place to address the long-term systemic change, why those things are paramount and just so much more important than I think a lot of us even may have thought. And, that's another reason why, even with a lot of the advocacy work that we've stepped into, whether it was focusing on digital literacy and connectivity for internet, basic needs that people had, or food insecurity, by serving on the, we're also a part of the Mayor's Office Food and Policy Advisory Policy Group that's looking at all of these different areas around food access. We also play a role on the racial equity and rapid response team. We were one of the initial anchor members to that particular effort and have continued to serve on there, which is now starting to help us get into a space where we are able to really start to address and advocate around resource distribution and, just a severe disinvestment that communities of color have suffered within the city of Chicago. And there's actually an effort that we're embarking on that we did in partnership with the Chicago COVID Fund and the Mayor's Office and Westside United to start an actual project. It's a research project slash development project that is really looking at how resources are allocated, distributed, and actually decided on in terms of in terms of how they flow through the city to the community. And this effort it's actually going to be starting up in January, but it's really designed to be led by community leaders and intersecting with all of the different agencies that impact resources and impact those decisions and make those decisions around how resources flow throughout our city. And so that's something that, is really at the forefront of our work right now, beyond a lot of the immediate response work that we continue to do. We've also been serving as a conduit for resources in our community. We've given out, over $140,000 in direct financial assistance to community members. We've also been a liaison for a lot of the agencies that make up the safety net in terms of grants and resources that we've been able to get to them to deal with a lot of their operational costs and provide unrestricted funding around some of the things that they, in terms of response, has been unconventional for them. And I think we've given out up to the degree of almost $700,000 that have flowed through us through various means of resource development. One in particular, we actually partnered with the United Way Worldwide to be a part of a fundraiser with BET, and was able to garner almost $500,000 in support through that effort that has been reinvested in the community. And I could go on and on, but I'll stop there and just see if you guys have any questions.
Well, I first wanted to say, Darnell, thank you so much. I think many of the people on this committee were able to visit us and Coming Together, your site. Was that last year? I don't know, even can remember anymore. So really get an idea that really helped to at least ground me in all the work that you're doing and your framework for bringing community and organizations together in Austin to take a look at the needs and serve everyone. So you seem like the ideal partner to really do all the work that you're doing. I know that through the city's racial equity rapid response team, you are a valued member and really engaging in that. And I know as we work towards distributing the vaccine when that comes out, that you, as many other partners, will be involved with sharing messaging to people to understand what that means, where they'll be in the queue, and really to help get that out and increase our vaccine rate. So thank you for all your work on that. Were there any questions from anyone on the committee besides trying to get in touch and be involved?
I would just briefly, this is Timmy speaking. The next staff presentation will be about a disinvestment project we're getting started. So the comments that Darnell made related to that work will be very interesting in that context. And I'm a project staff on that project, so we definitely would like to further engage with Darnell offline as that work gets further started.
Great, thank you. And before we go on, we do have one more member, a select member, for an update. I realized I did not have the Cmap staff and the other people attending introduce themselves. So we'll see if you can do this, if you can unmute yourself and just introduce yourself, how that's going to go. I mean, Timmy and Enrique, I guess Timmy, you introduce yourself. Enrique or anyone else from Cmap that's participating or is on the call?
I'm Kristen and Chuck with Cmap. Good morning.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Hi, this is Victoria Jacobson. I'm with Cmap.
Morning, everyone. Max Stern. You'll be hearing from me in just a few minutes, also with Cmap.
Good morning, Jamie Jackson with Cmap.
Hi, Erin Allam, I'm Executive Director at Cmap.
Great. Anyone else from Cmap?
Hi, good morning. Steve McMahon from Cmap.
And this is Quinn Castle with Cmap as well.
Morning, Stephanie Levine, Cmap.
Good morning, Courtney Barnes with Cmap.
Jana Gonzalez with Cmap.
Okay, I think we may have all the Cmap people. And anyone attending from the public, can you introduce yourself? Garland and Heather, I see that you're on here. Are you able to unmute yourself and just...
Hi, Garland Armstrong, former Cmap Citizen Advisory Committee and former Housing Committee.
Heather Armstrong, SIG-2.
Thank you very much. Is there anyone else that didn't introduce themselves? Okay, I think we have everyone. Okay, next we're going to move to our next select member, Jana Simon from the Illinois Public Health Institute. And if you can, I'm looking forward to having you share about how IPHI has maybe adapted to this situation and what work your organization is doing.
Great. Hi, everyone. Thank you. I'm Jana Simon. I'm a program director at the Illinois Public Health Institute, and we've gotten involved in a few different ways in some COVID response work. My colleague Jess, through some of the work she's been doing in a Cook County-wide hospital collaborative called the Alliance for Health Equity, has really been leading a lot of our COVID response work. We've focused on a few different areas, one of them being housing and homelessness. So we've been working with CHARGE, which is the Chicago Homelessness and Health Response Group for Equity, in close partnership with the City Health Department and the City DFSS, to staff some of the strategies along with lots of hospital partners on the work that they're doing to address homelessness during COVID. And some of it has included helping find temporary housing for folks who are homeless during COVID, and doing a lot of the connecting pieces to create a new system for homelessness response during COVID. We've also been representing health stakeholders on the Illinois Housing Roundtable, which is convened by Housing Action Illinois and NPC, which has been doing some COVID response work. And we've partnered with the city and enterprise community partners to hold information sessions and collect public comment on 2 policy plans related to equity, transit-oriented development, and affordable requirements ordinance in the city. And we've also had an action plan cohort working with housing developers in Chicago and suburban Cook to really focus on some of the COVID response in that area. I know we also held a webinar and early on training early in the pandemic around COVID-19 safety precautions and housing shelters as well. So trying to get as much information out to partners as possible around protection with people experiencing homelessness. We also worked with Health and Medicine Policy Research Group to help the city support getting PPE out to community settings. There was early on in the pandemic a big push, obviously, to get PPE out to hospitals and healthcare settings, but a lot of the community groups serving community food distribution didn't have the PPE they needed. So working to really coordinate donations and distribution of that across the city early on in the pandemic was a role we helped to play. And then with food, obviously food is a big issue right now. We've been participating with the Chicago Food Policy Action Council's Rapid Response Network, and then the city's Racial Equity Rapid Response and the county's Good Food Task Force to try to work on some of the systems for food distribution, emergency food distribution. And then we are participating on the vaccine core planning as well for the city, the county, and statewide for the vaccine distribution plan. So most of that is all through my colleague, Jeff, working at the city and county level. And then we also have a federal grant right now through the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. And through that, we'll be getting funding in 2021 to address physical activity, nutrition security, and social connectedness with that money. And we're in planning stages right now, but we'll be able to get money out to some communities to advance that work, including access to more equitable ways for essential travel, looking at nutrition tied to food security, and really trying to promote social connectedness for older adults who are increased risk for social isolation and loneliness, especially right now with COVID. So those are sort of the main, housing, PPE, and food are probably the three main areas of focus, but physical activity, because of this new funding, will become a part of the work as well, and really trying to maybe change community design so it's safer for people to be out walking and the safer ways of doing physical activity right now during COVID is through community design, as well as essential travel will be the focuses, foci of those strategies. So we're in the middle of that planning, but we're expecting it's about $200,000, and we're going to try to get a good portion of that out to communities in 2021 to help further support this work. So mainly a lot of partnerships and some funding and coordination work that we've been doing at IPHI. I'll stop there because I know we're probably short on time.
Yes, thank you, Jana, so much. And I wanted to thank, both of you, as obviously everyone hears, and the work that you do is really in partnership with all these different organizations, with the city, with different counties, and Cmap, really trying to respond. I mean, I think that's sort of what holds out our committee also, probably other committees too, but ours, I really hear the connection and partnership and collaboration among all of our efforts, especially during the pandemic. So, but obviously, as Darnell and Jana bring out, that this is the work that needs to be done at all times, and coming together now will hopefully strengthen our work for the future. So thank you so much for sharing your work. And if anybody, you can contact Darnell or Jana individually if you have any questions or want to follow up or connect with Timmy and such. So next, as we did preview, Matthew Stern is going to give an update on Cmap's work on the Disinvestment Research Project. Take it away.
Sherry. Thank you. Can you guys hear me all right? All right, great. Good morning. My name is Matt Stern. I'm a policy analyst here at Cmap, and I'm excited to talk to you guys today about this project. This is a work that I'm working on with Timmy, and so we are eager to get this committee's feedback. Enrique, actually that slide's fine, no worries. So this is work that is work that has been ongoing, and we're excited to pick it up and run with it. Just to give you a little bit of context, and I know this group is already fairly familiar with much of this because you guys were a part of advising and leading much of this in the build up to Onto 2050. This work really sort of stems from our inclusive growth work, which emphasized that economic opportunity for all residents in the region is key to moving the region forward, as well as the importance of reinvestment and infill from an equity perspective, but also sort of a fiscal, like local government fiscal health perspective, land use perspective, transportation perspective and climate change perspective as well. Both our inclusive growth and reinvestment and infill work represented key parts of Onto 2050. There had also been some initial staff work after Onto 2050 was first approved that on this topic that we're also building on. Next slide, please. So our disinvestment work really stems from two Onto 2050 recommendations. One of them is to invest in disinvested areas, and the other is to target infill infrastructure and natural area investments to be as efficient and effective as possible by coordinating those investments. We know that this is very much not a new topic for the region, and we're really interested in taking this on from a sort of a regional policy scale, but doing so with the support and in consultation with all of the experts who have been doing this work for many years, including, frankly, a number of members of this committee. Next slide, please. So you'll be familiar with this map. This is a map describing the geography of disinvestment in the region. The hashed areas represent the region's largest employment centers. The blue areas represent what we call the disinvested layer. These are our census tracts that have experienced multi-decade reductions in commercial investment and reductions of employment levels. The yellow areas are what we call economically disconnected areas. This is more of the demographic analysis that identifies low-income communities, communities of color, and communities where English is spoken as a second language. And then the green areas, of course, are both disinvested areas and economically disconnected areas. This map, I think, tells many different stories. The most important story for right now, I believe at this stage of this work, is that disinvestment is both very much concentrated to certain areas of the region, while simultaneously being widespread throughout the region. There are disinvested tracts, excuse me, all across the region, including in all 7 counties, and starting to grapple with both this concentration and distribution of disinvestment is a part of this project. Next slide, please. So we, in our approach to this, we're sort of taking a 2-step process here. The first is to assess the conditions and drivers of disinvestment across the region, and to do so with sort of 2 things in mind. One is bringing a racial equity lens to this understanding and research, and the other, the other is really understanding disinvestment as very much a structural problem that warrants sort of larger policy level solutions. And then the second is to build on that sort of increased understanding to develop those policy recommendations that can effectively intervene in cycles of disinvestment through targeted interventions. Next slide, please. So I want to, with that background in mind, I want to take the next few minutes to talk a little bit about our draft approach to this. This is very much still something that we're in the process of developing, and we're really interested in this group's feedback on our thinking and our plans for how we want to go about doing this, because it keeps getting bigger and bigger, and trying to figure out how to sort of hone in and cover what we need to cover, but get to where we need to get efficiently is something that we're working on now. Next slide. So there's sort of three, I think, larger points I want to make about our framing. The first is seeing disinvestment as one possible result of a dynamic system of multiple cycles that are each self-reinforcing, including at least sort of a local government fiscal health cycle, a physical cycle in terms of the sort of quality of both privately owned physical structures as well as public physical infrastructure, and then an economic cycle. And by that, I mean the way in which demand and sort of society's choice about the assignment of value to property as an expression of that demand can sort of play off of itself. And we see these things as sort of each self-reinforcing in and of themselves, but also really interlinked and interconnected to each other. Right, reduced tax rates can lead to elevated property taxes. Elevated property taxes can create barriers to new economic development. Barriers to economic development can lead to decline in value, and the cycles can begin again. The important point that I want to make here is that our framing of this right now is that these systems can work in the upward direction and in the downward direction. And so disinvestment is sort of just one possible result of them, which leads into the second point on this slide, which is seeing disinvestment as really intrinsically tied to both historic and present day systemic racism. There's a substantial body of research that I know this group is very well aware of about redlining, urban renewal, and other sort of urban policies that have had disparate impacts on Black and Brown communities, and recognizing that that is sort of deeply linked to where disinvestment comes from and why some communities are disinvested and others are experiencing substantial and continued investment. And then the third framing pillar, I guess, is that despite the challenges that disinvested communities experience, that those communities have numerous assets, and that we're seeking to continue to center those assets in this work as we go about it. Next slide, please. So our plan here is to start with a series of smaller sort of bite-sized data analysis projects that look at various aspects of those different cycles that I talked about on the previous slide. The things that we're hoping to look at, some of these things we're working on right now, others we hope to start in the next few months, include looking at residential and commercial vacancy around the region, business and residential like mortgage lending, the distribution of transportation spending in the region, as well as getting a better understanding of the spread of local government fiscal health in the region and how that relates to the prevalence or experience of disinvestment within that local government's jurisdiction. Each of these projects would involve some stakeholder interviews, some literature review, and some data analysis. And the goal would be to put together sort of a small package that could be brought back to this committee and other working committees, specifically the Land Use and Housing Committee, for discussion and having the committee sort of help us deepen and advance our thinking on these topics over time. Next slide. Moving from those sort of smaller sort of bite-sized chunks, we would then hope to move into a policy development phase where we're really beginning to identify points of intervention within those cycles that I was talking about a minute ago to spur equitable reinvestment, and to do so through strengthening existing relationships that we have and tapping into work in the region that is already underway in this space. Our goal would be to produce policy recommendations during fiscal year 2022. I really struggle with that year, saying that year, and then to have our disinvestment work be ongoing in Cmap's policy work moving forward after that. Next slide. So I talked a little bit about next steps over the last few slides. Our goal would be to do a series of interviews with partners this winter, produce those interim deliverables during 2021, and then hopefully move into that sort of policy recommendation space in 2022. And I'd like to use sort of whatever time Sherry lets me know we have left to hear your feedback on this and to have a little bit of discussion about whether you think we're moving in the right direction or what you think we should be hitting on that we haven't captured here. Next slide, please. There are a couple of discussion questions that I just wanted to throw up on the presentation, but obviously we're happy to entertain discussion of any of this. The questions that were on our mind were how does this investment show up in your community or impact your work? Are there particular aspects of this problem that you think it's especially important for Cmap to drill down on? And then, of course, the perpetual question in our presentations, I think, who should we be talking to? Who's out there that we should connect with that may not already be on our radar? And I'll stop there. And I think Timmy and I at this point would just love to hear thoughts. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Matt. That's really interesting. It's an idea of how to move forward. I guess I could just start with a question. Are the municipalities, those governments, interested in really focusing on these disinvested areas within their communities? It looks like it's maybe a part of a community, and their commitment, especially now with all the concerns going on with businesses and the economic impacts from COVID.
Are you sort of asking specifically in the context of COVID and where local governments are sort of oriented right now?
I mean, yeah, that'd be interesting. I guess in the sense of the commitment, it seems like it would take commitment from the municipalities, and now, given there's a lot of priorities, where this sort of fits in, because it would need the commitment of these municipalities to work on it.
Yeah, I think that's a great question. To some degree, our orientation with this work is not only partnering with local governments, but also sort of identifying maybe state level changes that can be made sort of at the policy level in order to support local governments in being able to better address disinvestment within their jurisdiction and give them additional tools to do so. And so I think that a long-term hope of this work is to increase the toolkit, and by doing so, hopefully increase the ability of local governments to respond to these issues. The other thing that I think is worth bringing up there is that one of the analyses that we'd like to do is get a better understanding, sort of at the municipal level, of the different experiences of disinvestment by municipality. There are clearly municipalities that experience very low to no disinvestment, and others that experience sort of a vast combination of both, with the city of Chicago being the most obvious example there, and then others that may be predominantly disinvested. And so getting a sense of sort of what that distribution looks like around the region, I think will hopefully inform that conversation. And we're still so early in this, where we haven't yet really sat down with municipal leaders to get a sense of what their perspective is and how it's changing because of COVID. So I appreciate the feedback. That's good for us to keep in mind.
Hey, Matthew Darnell.
Yeah.
I'm curious. When did you all start this effort? How long has it been going on?
So Timmy and I have both been working on this for I'd say over the last 8 to 12 months or so, beginning to sort of think about what a structure and approach to this might look like. But we're building on work that has been done by other Cmap staff, much of which was published in the workup to Onto 2050 and then Onto 2050 itself, and others of which it has not been published, but I know this committee was consulted on, I think in 2018, 2019. Yeah, does that answer your question?
Yes. Actually, I got a couple questions.
Yeah.
one other is, have you all, since you started this, have you all seen a shift or an increased amount of interest in this effort that you all have been facilitating since starting it with COVID and, you know, everything that has happened over the last several months?
Yeah, I mean, I think that you know, I think many of the things that you touched on in your update at the beginning of this meeting, I think bear re-mentioning here. There's sort of in the last year since we started this, there's sort of two big obvious things that have happened. You know, COVID and the disparate impacts of COVID-19 on Black and Brown communities on one end, and then the unrest following the recent police killings and the protests over the summer. You know, I think the combination of both of these events has changed the tenor and depth of conversation that's happening in the region and around the country. And the degree to which that proves out into sort of real ongoing policy commitment to making changes, I think I'd say we're holding our breath, but more than that, we're hoping to you know, have this project be a part of encouraging that sustained commitment. I think it's probably too early to know yet.
Okay. And I know this is a regional. This effort is taken into account like across the whole region. So I know one of the municipalities is Chicago, right?
Yeah.
In addition to others. And so I know one of your questions was, you know, who should Cmap be talking to? Of course, I would say the mayor's office with the Office of Equity and Justice, Candace Moore and her team, because a lot of the things that we've been dealing with or kind of approaching and through the racial equity rapid response that directly works with her office is, you know, this whole ideal of equitable resource distribution, which is seen or we're looking at it as how do you develop solutions to address the disinvestment that's been longstanding and all the implications that it's had. But one thing that comes to mind and from your presentation when I think about that work that we're, you know, exploring on a very contextual level, you know, in the context of our communities and Black and Brown folks throughout the city of Chicago, is not so much the value of the places, but how the value of people have really is really at the heart of this disinvestment. Because the one thing that I've noticed, certain people don't experience disinvestment where they reside. And so I'm just wondering, will your research touch on that or look to expose that? Because that's when you say that systemic racism is at the, you know, as a part of that, I think that's what it really comes down to. And that's something that we're looking at even with our project that we're embarking on. One of the areas or phase of it is a secondary research piece that I feel like what you all are doing would really would really satisfy in terms of understanding how municipalities are like approaching you know, how they're approaching equitable distribution in relation to the pandemic. Because we've seen where initially there was investment or there was, you know, no investment in these communities, and then the pandemic hits, and now all of a sudden resources come from everywhere. And so we're wanting to understand what sort of what policies and practices have a lot of these sort of actors circumvented in order to respond in the way that they have during the pandemic, where historically there has been no response. And so, you know, it's those types of things. And then I'm also wondering and I can only speak, for the municipality of Chicago, but when you think about engagement with different stakeholders to be able to kind of understand like quantitative, qualitative impact or assess, those things from a data perspective, how granular are you all looking to get? Is it just going to be, with the municipalities and with those offices, or are you looking to go deeper into collectives or other intermediaries that maybe garner more of a perspective across some of these communities that touch and go into the roots of those, touching those people? And so that you can really kind of get some qualitative context on how this disinvestment has impacted them over time.
Yeah, I mean, you want to stay on the phone for 45 minutes after this committee meeting?
Listen, I would love to, however much time you and Timmy would like to have, I'd love to sit down and talk with you guys more about this and even see if there's an opportunity to marry up some of the things that we're looking to do, because we're actually going to be working with Chris Rudd, a researcher out of IIT, on this particular project. And one of the pieces to this is trying to engage with other organizations and entities that are also approaching this issue to best understand, not reinvent the wheel and have redundancy around what we're all doing, but to identify who's doing what and how we can all kind of work together and collaborate to really kind of, circle the wagons on this issue, because it's so massive. I heard you say that it continues to grow. Like as you keep digging, it's a rabbit hole. And so I know it's going to take more groups and more resources to really dig into this, to start to come up with some real policy recommendations, practices, things that we need to put forth as solutions to, one, address and dismantle all those things, but then reinvent what needs to be put in place so that things are equitable from here on.
Yeah, well, thank you. I really appreciate your comments, and I think we will for sure follow up with you to talk more. I think the one thing that makes sense to respond to right now, because this may impact others' comments, is that in terms of who else we should be talking to, I think the more granular end of your spectrum is definitely on our list. It's not just municipalities and sort of larger public interest organizations, but also community groups and folks that are a little bit more coming at it from a sort of a grassroots community organizing perspective. We'd certainly be very interested in that space. And to your point about everyone else working in this space, I mean, we don't want to redo work that's already been done. We're trying to figure out how we fit into this ecosystem. And so continuing the conversation with you and the IIT partner, we'd be really interested in. So thanks, appreciate it.
Definitely, look forward to it.
Yes. This was as a liaison as well as a project staff. I deeply appreciated all your comments, Darnell, and I believe Erin had mentioned this previously in a meeting, but there will be, Cmap is undertaking a new initiative about equitable engagement, and in the coming year that will be stood up, and that is seeking to in a more structured manner have an avenue for Cmap to have ongoing engagement with more grassroots or more marginalized communities and organizations, and I think both Matt and I would be very interested in finding ways through that process and also through just other stakeholder interviews to make sure that those voices and inputs also are represented in the work going forward.
This all sounds really great. I hope that we can continue that. Matt, you and Timmy will know you'll be here, but come back and keep us up to date on the work going on, and I know you had identified your indicators that you were going to monitor. Maybe you might be adding some to that, and then also talking about, obviously there's a lot to talk about within Chicago, but within the other communities throughout the area, Cmap area. So if people have suggestions or people that that Matt and Timmy should contact, please let them know, because we really need to make sure this is addressed throughout the whole area that we're working in.
Hey, Sherry, this is Obai. I wish we would have had more time to talk about this particular topic. I don't know that there's a topic more germane to the purpose of this committee and to the work that we're doing on the ground in neighborhoods than this one. Given that we're running short on time here and I got a lot to say, is there a way to reconvene us or people who are interested in a deeper dive into this work, giving us a lot more space and time to share feedback?
That's a great idea. I don't know, Matt and Timmy, if you maybe want to pull together something.
Yeah, I second that.
I would just quickly say I think that's a great suggestion, and we sort of knew that this topic, as big as it is, needed a lot more space, and we didn't see this to be the be all and end all. So we really thought of this as just to get this on committee members' radars, and so I think we'll be really open to thinking of ways that we can get some of that deeper conversation as we continue on the work.
Great, thank you. Was there any other comments before we go on?
No. I just second both.
Okay. Thanks, Enrique.
Me too.
Okay. Next, we have another really important topic. Kristen Inchak will give an update on building equity into Cmap's climate initiatives. And I guess I wanted, before you go on, and not to take any of time, again, really am heartened, not that we thought Cmap wouldn't, but really the strength of your work and looking at disinvestment, looking at equity with all of your work. I mean, I think it really rings true to what all of our committee members are prioritize and really want to, in all of our work, to bring forward. So I'm really happy to, again, not that it wasn't there before, but really like to see the specific focus on it. So thank you so much.
Thanks, Sherry. And I would also, if Erin's still on the call, just say that has really been driven from the top of the organization, and we feel sort of empowered to move these issues forward through our work. And there's a real staff commitment here to this. So I worked together actually with Timmy and Matt to think through some of the things that we're going to be talking about in this presentation, and it dovetails really nicely with the disinvestment information that Matt was just sharing, because this is going to talk more about the people aspect of disinvestment, which is the vulnerable populations or economically disconnected areas, as we've called them before. But I'll get into that more in a few slides. So I'm Kristen Inchak. I'm a principal planner with Cmap. I've been with the agency for almost 10 years and have been a part of most of Cmap's climate work in the lead up to Onto 2050 through development of our climate resilience strategy paper, and was one of the authors of our climate recommendations as well. And at this point, we are creating a 3 to 5 year implementation plan for the different climate recommendations that are in Onto 2050 to really prioritize them. And that's why I'm here today to share with you some of the thinking behind our vulnerable populations that are disproportionately affected by climate change, and get your thoughts on how we could flesh that work out a little bit more and draw on your expertise. So I'm hoping we can have a discussion. Next, can you grab the next slide, please? I'm going to go really briefly through some climate change impacts. I know most people are probably familiar with these, but it never hurts to refresh. I will touch again briefly on some of the main climate recommendations from ON to 2050 and also tell you about that multi-year implementation planning work that's happening this year. And then I want to spend most of the time talking about disproportionate impacts to certain populations and how that builds on the economically disconnected areas that you have seen many times at this committee. And I have a bunch of discussion questions for you as well. Next slide, please. So just to start out with some of the climate change trends and impacts that we've been seeing, this is a chart that shows our emissions for the year 2015. And in that year, we saw about 67% of our emissions coming from building energy use. So that would be in residential, commercial, and institutional and manufacturing buildings. And then the vast majority of the other emissions were related to transportation. So you can see on this pie chart what the pretty granular breakdown is, but if you were to take away two things, it's really just energy and transportation that are comprising most of our emissions in the region. Next slide. And you can see that the emissions have been declining in recent years. We saw a decrease from 2010. And when we were working on the emissions inventory, our consultants put together some scenarios for the future in terms of what we could expect to see for emissions going forward. Scenario 2 is if we continue our previous trend into the future. Scenario 3 is if we double our reductions from what we've seen recently. And you can see that both scenarios 2 and 3 with those kind of dramatic increases in scenario 3 don't even get us close to what our goal is, which is the dashed line at the bottom. And that's our climate stabilization goal, which is 80% reduction in emissions over 1990 levels. And so pretty dramatic action is actually needed to get us towards stabilizing our global climate. Next slide, please. That's going to lead to some dramatic climatic changes for the Midwest region. The slide is showing what we can expect in terms of increase in annual average temperature. So the dark red on the bottom right is the highest emission scenario by the end of the 21st century, and we could see an increase in temperature of up to 8 degrees. We've already seen 1.5 degrees in recent years, and this could be a really fundamental shift in terms of our region's climate and what we can expect here in terms of extreme weather. It's also of note on this slide and the next one that we're currently trending toward the high emission scenario, which is not somewhere we want to be. We want to be in the lowest scenario possible. Next slide, please. So this slide shows you what we can expect in the future in terms of annual increases in precipitation. And what we see in the on the top right are that we can expect some pretty drastic increases in precipitation by the end of the 21st century, especially in the winter and spring months. And we also know that that precipitation is going to be consolidated into fewer events. So we're going to see bigger storm events in shorter time frames, essentially. That has a variety of impacts, both the heat and precipitation in terms of flooding, increased periods of drought, and extreme temperatures. You can go ahead, Enrique, thank you. So for ON to 2050, our chapter goal, which is our super broad goal to set up our recommendations, is a region prepared for climate change. And hit the arrow, Enrique. We've got two main sort of recommendation buckets. One is to intensify our climate mitigation efforts from Go to 2040. Go to 2040 included a series of related mitigation efforts that tried to reduce emissions over time so that we can see less drastic climate impacts ultimately. But we also need to plan for climate resilience because we acknowledge that some climate change is going to be unavoidable in our region at this point, given the sort of emissions that have already occurred here. Next slide. In our multi-year implementation planning, we have selected some priority ON to 2050 strategies to look at in terms of moving forward with our 3 to 5 year plan. And those are listed on this slide. These are areas where Cmap has particular purview or we think could move the needle, especially with regard to climate change. So The first, transforming transportation systems to reduce emissions. The next one is to look at climate issues with regard to local planning. So really trying to get mitigation and resilience implemented at the local level. The next, strengthening gray and green infrastructure to withstand climate change. The following one, exploring a regional climate resilience platform that would help to coordinate initiatives and partners in order to get sort of our resources all going in the same direction, and also providing data and resources to our partners, along with resources on how to interpret data and use it. The next, enhancing economic innovation related to climate. And then the one that I really want to focus on today is the last one, about addressing environmental challenges that disproportionately affect specific populations in disinvested areas. Next slide. What we're working on this year, just for a brief overview for our climate work plan, is primarily focused on this implementation planning work we're doing. And then the remainder of the work plan you can see listed here. I'm happy to talk more about any of these, but I won't go through them individually just for the sake of time. And you can go to the next slide. The multi-year implementation planning is taking these priority strategies that we identified from the plan, thinking through what Cmap's role is, what strategic projects we could take on that could help advance that topic area, and also thinking specifically about how to integrate equity and further advance that across the different subjects that we're thinking about, in addition to having maybe specific projects related to vulnerable populations and equity. So if you see at the arrows on the bottom of this slide are showing you our overall process for the implementation planning. We're currently in the orange arrow of identifying and prioritizing our project list. And I just want to hit home that even though we are prioritizing equity and vulnerable populations, how we approach this for the coming years is really up for discussion at this point, and we have not yet solidified how we're going to be moving it forward, but we do have some ideas. Next slide. So I want to talk specifically about how what we term as vulnerable populations in the region could have disproportionate impacts from climate change. Next slide. There are a variety of different climate impacts that we expect to see just from our existing emissions and the effects that it's having on our regional climate. We can expect damages to infrastructure, negative effects on public health, especially for the elderly or those with chronic health conditions and others, pretty significant property damage from flooding and even extreme temperatures, and economic impacts as well. The one thing that's not included on this slide that also has pretty dramatic negative effects from climate change is our natural environment. So there are a whole series of different strategies related to that as well. And as we know, with any sort of shock or stress, it's often the communities that are least well equipped that have disproportionate impacts. And so the next couple of slides, I just want to talk through what some of those might mean for the climate area in particular. If you could advance, Enrique. First, I want to talk about the term vulnerable populations, which is one that has been discussed a lot in recent years. We're still talking about it now, and whether it's the right term or not is something I would appreciate your feedback on. But I know you all are familiar with the economically disconnected areas definition of low-income, limited English-speaking communities and low-income people of color. And so I want to differentiate vulnerable populations to say that on top of those EDA characteristics, we would be looking at different groups that could be disproportionately affected by climate impacts, such as the elderly, people with chronic health conditions, those without health insurance, those with disabilities, renters, and there are others as well. And so we really need to, as part of an implementation project, think through which groups are we really talking about that have disproportionate impacts from climate change. This is not something we were really able to flesh out through the On to 2050 process, but we know that it's important to do. And so this is the group of folks who I'm trying to get at when I talk about the disproportionate impacts through this presentation. So next slide, please. And so a couple examples of specific vulnerabilities. I'm going to talk about flooding and heat. So you know the economically disconnected areas and disinvested areas map. This is the third or fourth time you're seeing it today. And you know kind of the pattern of where we're seeing these cohorts throughout the region. It's interesting to juxtapose that with the Urban Flooding Susceptibility Index, which is an index that we created to show where areas in the region are more susceptible to flooding. It doesn't show where flooding will happen, but it's just sort of a visual for assessing where it's more likely to flood. And urban flooding is things like basement backups, street inundation, low-lying area ponding, and things like that. So the dark blue is showing you areas that are more susceptible, and the light green is the least susceptible. And you can see in just comparing the two maps that there is a lot of overlap between where the dark blue happens and where the disinvested and EDA areas are. Next slide, please. So this chart is actually showing you in comparison of the disinvested areas and EDAs with the Urban Flood Susceptibility Index, that the disinvested and EDA areas are much more likely to be exposed to flooding vulnerability than other parts of the region. So just in looking at this graph, you can see, but we know that there's more to explore here in terms of on-the-ground impacts. Next slide. In terms of heat vulnerability, this is an area that we started to get into with the Onto 2050 development, but there's more work that needs to be done. This year, we're creating a heat vulnerability index, which will be an interesting exercise to show us again, in looking at the region, where are those concentrated areas of heat exposure and vulnerability. For the strategy paper for climate resilience in the lead up to Onto 2050, we created this chart that shows which socioeconomic groups within the region could be concentrated within the top 10% of hottest census tracts. And you can see that some of the groups that we think could be considered vulnerable populations for climate changes would be disproportionately concentrated in those hot census tracts. So there's more exposure and there's more risk of those populations having negative outcomes from climate change. And while we performed these analyses over the past few years, I don't want to say that we've done that work and it's done. We know that there's a lot more to dig into with this and to define so that we can incorporate it into our strategies moving forward. So the Onto 2050 strategy that was created for this issue is very broad, and we were tasked through the multi-year implementation planning with taking this strategy and turning it into something that actually would be achievable in a 3 to 5 year period. So Onto 2050 says address environmental challenges that disproportionately affect specific populations and disinvested areas. That's not something that we can address in 3 to 5 years. I don't know if we can address it in 15 or 20 years. It's a very complex topic. So we broke it way down to understanding what climate impacts on vulnerable populations are, defining those populations, and identifying Cmap's role in mitigating the impacts. Next slide. Sorry for all the text on here. This is how, over the next 3 to 5 years, the group of Timmy, Matt, and myself thought that we could move forward with this work, and I'd appreciate any comments you have here. The first is to do the work of defining vulnerable populations, building on our previous definitions like EDAs, so that we can think about climate-specific vulnerabilities. The next one is that we would look at climate impacts and how they're affecting the vulnerable populations that we define in the first bullet. So the impacts we would look at would include extreme temperatures, repetitive flooding, and reduced air quality. We may uncover others that we need to consider as well. And we want to also look at the geographic distribution of social and physical vulnerability, and as well as the causes. One of the things that we talked about as a team is that it's one thing to look at the impacts and say, how do we treat the symptoms? But without looking at the underlying disease and why this is happening, we're not really solving the problem. So we wanted to make sure that through this process, we would be looking at that in order to acknowledge it and consider whether there are other projects we can do to help in that way. The third bullet is really important for this subject, and I'm sure you all are aware of the importance of this too, is really engaging with the groups that are impacted by climate change in order to collaboratively develop solutions and understand what it is that those groups need in order to address the issues that they're facing. We also want to think about historic levels of investment or disinvestment and the currently available resources that communities have. And so we are proposing to talk to regional responders who have a role in helping different communities through these types of climate impacts. And then the last is to look at action steps for Cmap and our other stakeholder partners to help mitigate climate impacts. And at the end of this process, we would hope at the end of a 2 or 3 year period to have a multi-year plan for Cmap to actually take action to move forward. Next slide, please.
Kristen, just to briefly butt in, Enrique Salgado, you had a few questions in the chat I wanted to draw to your attention. Well, the first one about whether these slides will be available for reference. Yes, we will post them on the website afterwards. But then more substantive to the two other questions he had was, has this been presented, this I think just being some of the various analyses that you had presented, Kristen, to other environmental entities and orgs such as water reclamation? And then a second question is there an overlay of the heat map or of a heat map with open space or park availability?
And also I'll add, right, because the last piece that was I was thinking about was an overlay, right, in regards to the heat map, but then just the overall plan was planning period, right, in regards to IMD historically, right, Chicago industrial, the manufacturing districts that used to exist and the transitions, and then also where they are, you know, in relationship to the environmental factors affecting communities, especially as it relates to equity, because those tend to be separate and looked at, one as workforce and then the other one as climate justice. And yeah, I'd be real interesting to be able to see that as we start to plan and work and start to see also shifts in historically, going to the previous presentation, right, historically disinvested communities who were historic IMDs and are now in this transition. In some cases, some manufacturing is coming back, in other places it's not, and then how all of this plays together, I think would be very interesting to be able to see, because one impacts the other, but many times are not linked.
Yeah, that's a great point, and I appreciate that idea. So the heat spatial analysis for the heat index is being done this year, so we don't actually have that information yet. It's being developed right now, but I think it's a really good idea when we have it to look at open space and maybe potentially workforce or manufacturing along, and there's a whole lot of analysis that we can do once we have that. But I am not on that project team, and I'm not up to speed on where, you know, what is going on specifically with it right now. With regard to the previous question, the environmental entities that have reviewed the flooding vulnerability work has been presented at a lot of different conferences to other groups as well. And the heat work was part of our climate strategy paper, which was reviewed by lots of different stakeholders throughout the plan process as well. So it's all historical work that Cmap has done, where right now we're talking about developing a new sort of body of work around this for the vulnerable populations piece. I wanted to pause here, and that was a good segue to me, and to just see if there are any other general questions or comments about our approach or anything else that I talked about.
I have one thought when I was thinking about your vulnerable populations that you're identifying and thinking about, and I'm trying to think about how children fit into this, if they should be considered one. I know that they kind of mirror sometimes our older population, the same way they're more susceptible to certain diseases and things that can be spread when we have flooding or things like that. So that was just one thing I've been trying to think about how that could fit in possibly, but that was my only thought.
Yeah, and I have heard of children being included in that set of groups before, so I think that's a really good point. And I should also mention that Cmap is not the first organization that has thought about this. There's lots of different groups, even ones in Chicago, like the UIC Brace Center, that has looked at social vulnerability and climate vulnerability. So we would hope to draw upon those resources and not reinvent the wheel with this. Any other questions? I have a lot of questions for you all. Okay. So I think that at this point, as I mentioned, we're really focused on work planning and trying to develop some activities that would get us toward our goal of connecting the dots with this subject. One of the things that I'll just say about the multi-year planning is that it's a little frustrating to me that we would get through 2 or 3 years of kind of thinking about this, defining the problem and understanding the landscape, and then we still have to figure out how to take action. So one of my big questions is, how can we fast track our work so that we can get to making an impact sooner than later? So if you guys have any thoughts on that, I would really appreciate it. One of the things, as I mentioned, is really tapping into existing resources and existing groups that are working on this. And so that kind of gets to my first question of what efforts are underway that could help us, and what groups should we be connecting with?
Well, this is Sherry. I just wonder, I know that environmental impact assessments are done for different projects. So does that process include climate change, or the more specific ways of approaching it? Is that something that could be added in to that? And then in connection with that, just as we do health impact assessments, to make sure that we include climate change, some good set of way that we can collect different information and indicators on that would be probably helpful to a lot of the organizations that are doing more health or equity impact assessments.
That's a great point. And the environmental impact assessments, I actually just